So first of all, thanks for hosting us. Thanks to the Aspen Institute and to the Kochs for making this possible. It's great to see everybody up bright and early here in Aspen. I'm on East Coast time, so I wake up at 5:30. So it's actually good to have something to do this early in the morning. But you know, Amy, I thought. Obviously, we'll get into your book and what motivated you to write it and what you were thinking and sort of how it applies to politics today. But I imagine that most people here know me as the author of Hillbilly Elegy, if they know me at all, and most people know you as the author of Political Tribes, or as, of course, the Tiger Mom. We called her at Yale Law School the Rabbit Professor because she was not very mean to us as a professor. But they may not know that we actually have a background and a history that goes back much further than our respective authorial careers. And you were actually my contracts professor my very first year of law school, my first semester of law school. Actually, I believe the first time that I ever saw my wife was in your contracts class. She was not my wife then. And you also were one of the people who really encouraged me. I'd say the main person who encouraged me to write Hillbilly Elegy. But I wonder if maybe we could just talk a little bit about not the first class I had with you, which is contracts, but the second class, which was international business transactions. And one of the real themes of that class, as I remember it, and maybe I'm remembering it wrong, I hope not, is that a big driver of ethnic and tribal conflict, especially in the developing world, are these market-dominant minorities, these folks who aren't necessarily majoritarian in the countries that they live in. They can't necessarily access or exercise political power, but they have, for whatever reason, whatever historical reason, they have this remarkable economic power that drives frustrations and drives resentments. And I'm curious just how that thinking maybe led you into this book, and maybe we could kick it off there.
Great. Well, thank you, JD. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. I love this funny connection that JD was my student, and we're happy to talk more about that. Hillbilly Elegy actually started off as an email to me, and then as one of his big papers. So we have all kinds of stories. But yes, that's a great question. So way before Tiger Mom, I principally wrote about foreign policy. That's actually my field, ethnic conflict and foreign policy. And this concept of market-dominant minorities, these are like the 1% Chinese in the Philippines, 1%. And yet the Chinese control about 60 to 70% of the Philippines economy. Same with the Chinese in Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries. But there are many different reasons for a market-dominant minority. Whites in South Africa are also a market-dominant minority, but for very different reasons. A history of apartheid in that case. To use a more recent example, the Sunni minority in Iraq was a form of market-dominant minority too. About 15% of the population, the Sunnis had sort of controlled everything, the vast oil wealth for hundreds of years, most egregiously under Saddam Hussein. And so what I've been writing about for 20 years is that Americans tend to romanticize democracy. We think it's the panacea for everything. You know, you got some group conflict, whatever, let's just have some elections. And what I've been writing about is that under certain conditions, democracy can actually catalyze group tensions, and in particular, in countries that have this really resented minority that is viewed as an outsider that's controlling all the power, when you suddenly democratize in that context, instead of getting peace and prosperity, what you often get is that democracy brings to power this kind of revengeful majority that is really angry at this little minority that's been wielding so much power and looking down on them. And you get this rhetoric like, let's take back the country for the real owners of the country. So to go back to JD's story, the way this book came to be is it was originally going to be completely just a foreign policy book. What really happened was I got sick of being known only as the Tiger Mom. I was on the Bill Maher show, I think, talking about Ukrainian nationalism, which I actually know something about. And after I thought I did decently well. And afterwards, I looked on the Twitter feed, and it was like, why does this Tiger Mom woman think she can talk about nationalism? So I thought, I'm sick of this. I got to get back to who I am. So I started writing this pure foreign policy book, about 3 years ago. And what happened is 2 months after President Trump was elected, this is in about February, or I think March or February of 2017, I was teaching the same class that JD was in, international business transactions. And I was doing the same message that I've had been saying for 20 years, which is, why we mess up our foreign policy so much in this country? It's because US dynamics are so different from developing country dynamics, like places like Iraq and Venezuela. And so I was reading a quote from one of my earlier books, and I said, under certain circumstances in developing countries, democracy can sweep to power a politician with no political experience, who, to the horror of elites, rides to power on a wave of racially tinged populism. And I was actually reading a passage about Venezuela. But I looked at my class, 80 people staring at me, and all thinking the same thing, which one young woman articulated, and she says, it sounds exactly like you're describing the United States. And at that point, I had 2 months to redo the book, and now it's actually so much. It's so interesting because to see the U.S., we tend to be very America-centric, what is going on. But if you see us as part of a much more common pattern, you understand why we're getting why we see the forms of tribalism that we're seeing today.
Great. So initially started as a book about foreign policy, and then you obviously, as you just said, made the connections between what was going on in international politics, sort of your expertise, and what was happening with domestic politics. And obviously, I've read the book, there's a fair amount of international politics still sort of sprinkled. You talk about Vietnam and our approach to Vietnam. You talk about our approach to Iraq and why that was mistaken. But it really is, I think, mostly about American politics. And so I wonder if you could walk us through the core thesis. What is political tribalism? What's happening in the United States? Why should we care about it?
Okay. So first of all, humans are tribal. We're hardwired to be that way. And I'm going to skip over, there are really some interesting studies that just show how tribal we are. We need to belong to groups. And once we connect to groups, especially certain kinds of groups, it's almost like, the effect is almost like a drug. You want to cling to your group and defend it no matter what, and think it's better no matter what. Now, tribalism is not always a bad thing. If you think of sports tribalism, that's kind of a fun, benign example. I'm a very tribal person. I think families can be very tribal, but it's only when tribalism takes over a political system that things get very dangerous, because at that point, everybody starts to see things only through the lens of their group, and then facts and arguments don't matter. It's just like whatever your side is saying, you just repeat it, and the other side is completely wrong, even if what they're saying is what your side was saying last year. And it's just, we can't have a conversation. So why are we seeing what we're seeing today? It goes back to JD's first question. We have, there's always been tribalism in the United States. We just didn't really notice it because for most of America's 200-year history, we had one extremely dominant tribe. We would call it, whites, who obviously is a construction, it was always a moving target, exactly who counted, but that was the basic dynamic, that whites were economically, politically, and culturally dominant. One factor that I think is contributing to political tribalism today is, as you all know, that today, for the first time in US history, whites are on the verge of losing their status as the majority in this country. And there's lots of debate about when it will happen, 2044, 2050, maybe it won't quite happen, what counts as white, but it's obviously something that is happening. There are many cities in the United States today that are already majority minority. So why is that important? Well, when you have a group, a country that's dominated really by one group, whether it's the Han Chinese in China or whites in the United States, lots of terrible things can happen, oppression, slavery, but when a group is comfortably dominant, it can also afford to be more generous, more universalist, and more embracing. Right now, what's happening is that every group in America feels threatened now. It's not just minorities, but whites feel threatened. A couple studies I show in my book, I think it's 67% of white working class, the white working class feel that they are subject to more discrimination than minorities. And I think it's fully 50% of all whites. And it's not just religious minorities like Jews and Muslims who feel threatened. Christians feel threatened. You really see this in the political rhetoric right now, the attack on the Bible. And it's with President Trump in the office, many women feel threatened. With the Me Too movement, many men feel threatened. Straights, gays, Latinos, Asians, everyone feels threatened. And studies show that it's when people feel threatened that they become more insular and they become more defensive and protective. Their boundaries harden and they become more tribal. So that's why I think we're seeing a form of explicit identity politics on both sides of the political spectrum. That's factor one. Factor two goes back to this market-dominant minority idea. So for most of our history, what really distinguished the United States from lots of these very turbulent developing countries is we didn't have a market-dominant minority. On the contrary, we had an economically and politically dominant majority. We never had one little teeny ethnic or religious minority controlling 70% of the wealth. But because of a second phenomenon, which is really kind of what JD it's the heart of his piece, and he's the spokesman in Hillbilly Elegy. A second thing that's happened is that class or education has split America's white majority. And as a result of these two factors, what I think we're seeing today is the emergence in the United States of our own really weird, idiosyncratic version of a market-dominant minority. Who am I referring to? Coastal elites. It's a misnomer because they're not all coastal, and they're not all elite in the sense that they're not all wealthy, not all white. But basically, I'm talking about all the people in this room. And at first, it's very idiosyncratic because, of course, coastal elites are not a single ethnic minority. They're not like Sunnis or they're not like Chinese. But if you think about it, the parallels are very striking. Wealth is overwhelmingly concentrated on the coasts in this country, whether it's Wall Street or Silicon Valley or Hollywood or the mainstream media. Coastal elites are not an ethnic group, but we are an extremely insular group. We intermarry and interact almost exclusively among ourselves. It is much more common for somebody growing up in Manhattan who attended Columbia to marry, a Nigerian American or an Asian American or a South Asian of similar academic background than somebody from Appalachia. And in fact, I've been saying that the divide between these two white tribes almost is so deep and acrimonious now. I mean, there's so little interaction between these sort of the coastal, more urban, more multicultural whites and the group that JD is intimately familiar with, call it rural, working class, southern, that divide is so deep now that it's almost like what we would call what social scientists would define as an ethnic divide. So the 2016 election, from this point of view, makes complete sense. Because remember I said earlier that when you have a market-dominant minority, over and over in countries from Zimbabwe to Indonesia to Malaysia to Venezuela to Bolivia, you will see a political demagogue rising to power by saying, you know why you're poor? You know why your life is not good? It's because this outsider group is controlling everything and they don't care about you. So vote for me and it's time to take back our country. And you can really, it's not explicit, but a lot of people believe that in the message "Make America Great Again," there were these overtones. Let's kind of take back the country, and President Trump has actually said it's time to take back our country from the Chinese, from Mexicans. So understood in this context, I think it's actually it's helpful to see it as part of a much larger global pattern, and you see similarly how the elites respond to that election as well.
Yeah, this group sorting is one of the most interesting arguments that you make between white working class and white non-working class people. And it's in some ways, I think, especially if you're sort of on this side of the divide, it's sometimes hard to notice just how different these two groups of people have become over the past 30 or 40 years. But if you think about the types of restaurants that people are eating at, the television shows that people are watching, the movies that people are watching, the types of places that they visit, raise your hand in this room if you have a passport. Virtually no one in my hometown, and in fact a majority of white voters do not have a passport. There is just this radical difference in the way that people construct and build their lives. And one of the undercurrents that I was always a little bit frustrated with during the 2016 election is it economic anxiety or is it racial anxiety that's motivating the Trump voter? And I always thought that was a little dumb because it almost presumes that there are only two thoughts that people can hold in their head: either I'm poor or I hate black people. And of course, people are a lot more complicated than that. But it also failed to account for the fact that when I talked to people back home, if there was a single group that they were most angry at, a single group that they were most frustrated at, it wasn't religious or ethnic minorities, it was coastal elites. It was the people who call the shots, the people who run the show, the people who work on Wall Street, the people who work in Silicon Valley. There was this palpable sense of anger at that group much more than any other group. And of course, you listen to President Trump's speeches, and certainly they're tinged with criticisms of Mexican immigrants or Muslims or whatever the case may be, but like 85% of his most visceral critical comments have always been at so-called coastal elites, the people who call themselves their betters. He even in a speech a few weeks ago said, I don't know why these people think they're so elite, I beat them. And there are people back home who listen to that and are like, oh my God, absolutely, finally somebody's going after that group of people. And I think to appreciate that fact, you have to appreciate that there has been this really important segmentation between white working class and non-working class voters. The other point that I'll make on that is there's this factor that the economist Tyler Cowen and a few other folks really worry about, this phenomenon of assortative mating, right? Like, your kids go to Harvard, they will almost certainly marry someone who's elite. I went to Yale Law School, I met my wife at Yale Law School. There's this way where 30 or 40 years ago, the upwardly mobile kids, if you came from suburban Detroit and you made it to Yale Law School, you'd probably come to Yale Law School with a wife, maybe with a kid. You'd go back home after you graduated and you'd reinvest that financial, social, and human capital in the community you came from. Now, the elites, as we call them, I agree it's an overgeneralized term, but it is useful, are much more likely to marry someone who's part of their social caste and then to locate in one of 5 places: DC, San Francisco, LA, or New York City, and maybe like Boston or Seattle, right? And that geographic sorting has, I think, both really important economic consequences, but it does give this sense of this cultural and social isolation that a lot of people perceive elites are engaging in.
And I'll just want to add to that. I totally agree with you about, is it race or economic anxiety? But there is a ethnic and kind of racial dimension to this coastal elite thing, because from the point of view of many people in the heartland, these coastal elites, they love minorities. They love immigrants. They just want to let more and more immigrants in. They care more about the poor in Africa than they do about the poor in America. So it's actually very easy to, a coastal elite is, Barack Obama is an example of a coastal elite. So I mean, for them, it's like a mixed group. So I think that's very helpful.
So my question is, what's the antidote to this? So one of the things you talk about in the book is the supergroup and the notion maybe of the United States or United States citizens as a supergroup. I'd like to just understand that concept a little bit more, because one of the things that occurs to me is that a potential antidote to the very extreme subgroup tribalism in the country is like a notion of an American nation that's a little bit more robust and a little bit more inclusive. And I don't know if that's quite the same thing you're getting at with the supergroup, but it strikes me as if it's not the same thing, it's at least a related concept.
Right. So believe it or not, I am an optimist. I have been going all over the country, and people always say, is there another model in all these countries that you've studied that could be that could help us get out of this political tribalism? And I always say, we are the model. I really believe that. We have the best apparatus, and let me be specific about that. I think we often forget exactly how unique and special our system is, because especially in this terrible moment. So what I explain in the book is that alone among the major powers, not the UK, not France, not Germany, not China, we are what I call a supergroup. And it's a very simple concept. You need to satisfy two requirements. The first is to have a very strong collective overarching identity capable of inspiring patriotism and loyalty, more like what you're getting at, American. But the second requirement for being a supergroup is you have to be a place that allows individual subgroup identities and tribal identities to flourish. So at our best, and this is different from a country like France, we have been a country where somebody can be, I'm Japanese American, I'm Mexican American, I'm Irish American, I'm Libyan American, and yet intensely patriotic at the same time. And we're not perfect, but that I think is, so it's not that we disagree, but there's a lot of, because of all this tribalism, there's this new burst of books about liberalism. We need to get back, assimilate, and of course that's good, but I think what I'm trying to say is it's impossible to tell everybody, just please wipe out your tribalism. It's hard. It would be like telling you guys, stop liking the sports team that you like. Imagine that. I mean, and that's, so if you tell people, and for me, it's kind of personal. I'm proudly American, but I was raised being very proud of my ethnic Chinese heritage. So I think the slight difference is, instead of just this melting pot thing, which is everybody has to be molded into this American, it's a little bit more flexible. I think it's a false choice. I think it's possible to have this. We need this connective tissue, and we can get to what I think that's why there are dangers to that. The American identity. But we don't necessarily need to extinguish all these subgroup identities. As to we forget, for example, that birthright citizenship. This is an incredible, almost nobody else has this. No European nation has this. No Asian nation has this. Very few countries have, this is simply the principle that anybody born on this soil, whatever their race or ethnicity or creed, is an American. And that's actually very unusual. So something going back to JD's questions, one of the biggest threats, I think that what to do, I think we need to all be much more protective of America's national identity. And I think that both the left and the right have to sort of heed different lessons. They're doing different things wrong. I come from one of the most liberal college campuses, and one thing that I see that worries me is what I see as almost like the progressive scorched earth approach to American history. I think it's incredibly valuable for progressives to point out that our history has been, to not whitewash our history. Like, it's not been as romantic. We did extinguish Native Americans. Many of our founders were slave owners. We have so many stains on our history, and we need to acknowledge that. But I think it's a huge difference between saying that we are a country with great principles that we have repeatedly failed to live up to, so we must try harder. There's a huge difference between saying that and saying that America is at its core a land of oppression. We are a land of white supremacy. We are a land of genocide. Because if we are truly nothing but a land of white supremacist genocide, then why is it even a country worth fighting for? And so I worry about this kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think the Constitution is really at the center of what can hold this country together, including the extreme left. And I worry too when I see, you see, this is a piece that we're actually going to be writing for The Atlantic, my husband and I. People saying, the Constitution is just a document by, dead white males, rapists. And so and I think it's possible to acknowledge that the founders or people who wrote this were very flawed in many ways, and yet at the same time, political visionaries who created the foundation of something. America is always an aspirational country. Now, on the right, it's another thing that will destroy the secret of America's national identity is these attempts to define America the American identity in a way that, in terms of whiteness or even just Protestantism or Christianity. I think that any attempt to define the American national identity in a way that is not open to people of all different creeds and backgrounds is itself, basically an attempt to sort of shut out half the country, and it's a sort of false patriotism, because it's not really unifying. It's really saying, it gets back to this two Americas idea, and that's what I think we need to get away from. We are at the point right now where so many people see people who voted on the other side, not just as people they deeply disagree with and want to argue with, but almost like immoral enemies, like un-Americans. And I think that is really dangerous. I think that's, I've studied countries all over the world where when that happens, the result is the country literally falls apart.
Yeah, so I have a comment to that, and also want to dive further into something. So when you're talking about the supergroup, this combination of a shared national identity, but where people's tribal affiliations can still sort of blossom under the surface, I immediately think of my wife's family. So my wife, as you know, is a first-generation Indian immigrant. I think that just because of how I perceive the duties that come along with belonging to the American nation, I'm a very patriotic person. That's very important to me. It was important to me that I marry someone who shares those same commitments. And Usha's a very patriotic person. She cares a lot about the country. She's currently clerking at the Supreme Court, which is, of course, I think speaks a little bit to her public service mentality. But she also is very proud of where her family came from. She's very proud of her heritage. She's very proud of her food. She's really into making sure that our kid, our 1-year-old baby, is exposed to these things. And it strikes me that that's like a very robust and durable way to experience American patriotism, is this sense that where I came from and who my parents and grandparents were really matters, but we're all still part of this shared national community. And I do think that, obviously there are a lot of countries that have sort of multiracial, multi-ethnic democracies that are pretty successful. But what's unique about America, at least in my anecdotal personal experience, is that sense that Usha and I are both citizens of a country, despite the fact that our genetic ancestry is completely different. It really is kind of unique. There's something about our shared sense of nationality that I think is unique, and I know that you and Jed have sort of a somewhat similar story. But the thing I wanted to dive into a little bit is you got at something that really concerns me about the current American left. And I'm a conservative, so maybe I'm talking a little bit out of turn. But one of the things I've noticed is that there's this increasing tension between what I might call Kennedy-style liberalism, this notion that America is an imperfect place. We have flaws in our history, as you mentioned, but there's this aspirational nature. We're constantly working towards correcting and perfecting the Union. If you think about the rhetoric of Martin Luther King, this was a promissory note. That is fundamentally an aspirational argument, that there's this thing out there that's worth aspiring to, even though it's had its historical problems. That's sort of one way of talking about the country and its problems. The other way that I think you see a lot more than I do, because you teach it at Yale, is this scorched earth. The country is fundamentally genocidal. The American project is fundamentally corrupt, and it's not worth really saving. And when I think about that as a rhetorical argument and the effect that it has on, people that I came from. My grandparents were Blue Dog Democrats. They were passionate Kennedy Johnson people. My grandfather voted for a Republican once, Ronald Reagan in 1984, and it was just because he really hated Walter Mondale. But the former argument, we're an aspirational nation, we have to live up to these really high ideals, that's persuasive to the people that I grew up back home. This is a genocidal nation, it's not worth preserving. That's not just not persuasive, it actually pushes people further from any kind of liberal or leftist politics. And just as a matter of strategy, I don't quite know why what I'd call the scorched earth progressivism is gaining so much steam, because it's just not a politically viable project in my view. But I'm curious what you think about that, what you're seeing at Yale, and sort of how you can manage and recapture that more aspirational liberalism as opposed to the scorched earth progressivism.
Great. So one of the things I describe in my book is I sort of try to explain how we came to this point where we have a very almost explicit identity politics on both sides. So for many, many generations, including the ones that I grew up in, the progressives actually embraced a group transcending more rhetoric. Like Martin Luther King, it's can we look for a day when color of skin doesn't matter? John Rawls, liberalism, actually the international human rights movement, which was when I was, coming of age, the super lefty progressives, the international human rights movement sought to transcend all types of group barriers, right? Not just race and gender, but even national. So there's a lot of tension. But fast forward to 2018, and today on college campuses or among progressives, group blindness is the ultimate sin. And the reason this happened is something I understand. Really around 70s and 80s, a lot of progressives started noticing that this kind of universalist language, group blind language, individual language, was being used to block affirmative action, or being used to stop policies from passing that were to help address racial inequities. So, and then they started noticing that, I'm looking around at all the people championing liberalism. They seem to, on college campuses, they all seem to be white males. And also, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this kind of battle against communism fell, and so thus was born the form of identity politics that we have now that is very group specific. On college campuses now, I've seen a change even in the last 5 years. Groups are, Black Students Association, whom I mentor, they will want to have their own retreat. If they want me to talk to them, even though it's the same message I'm going to deliver to the Asian American Association, they want separate meetings. The Asian group has splintered into 5. It's just more and more smaller groups, which isn't so bad, consistent with, I think that gives people solidarity. I think there's a place for that. What worries me is when those boundaries harden. And right now it's almost epistemological. The idea is you can't understand me because you're not a woman. You can't speak for me because you're not Chinese. You're not queer, so you can't participate in this dialogue. And that, I think, is dangerous because we need to have this kind of giant conversation. Sure. Immigration is a great example.
Sure.
This is a really hard question, and even, again, compared to like 5 or 7 years ago, views on immigration are way more extreme now on both sides. The left is way more left and the right is way more right. It used to be just 10 years ago, there was a lot of overlap in the middle. But we can't even begin to have a conversation about this.
Sure. So I know we're going to do a couple audience questions if we're getting to that point. But I just want one quick comment on that, maybe ending on an especially provocative note. It occurs to me that the language, the white supremacist Constitution, the idea that the Constitution was by for white people and white men, that argument is a premise that the far right and the far left both share. Now the conclusions are different. The far left says we want to, tear it up and create a more equitable society. The far right says, great, you're right. It is a white constitution for white people. Yeah. Let's continue to make that the case. But it is interesting how much overlap there is, not among the conclusions, but between the fundamental premises about what the Constitution was for, who it was for, and what its ultimate possibilities are. So it's an odd thing. So I guess we'll do questions now. We have 15 minutes. We'll take a few questions. I don't want to be the person to pick on people, so you can be.
Okay, great. Here. Yeah, you in the front. Yes.
Hi. I'm a psychologist, so I always think in terms of individuals. I'm wondering what you think we can do as individuals, like those of us in the room, those of us who hear you. What can we each do to embrace a more common humanity kind of tribalism rather than the common enemy kind of tribalism, as John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff talk about? What can we do? What are specific actions that we can take?
Great. I'm excited about this question, actually, because I think that if you just listen to social media and cable news, I mean, I can't even do it anymore. You get this one impression. But if you look, I've traveled the country, or you just even in a quiet room with lots of my students, I think most people have your view. It's exhausting to feel so much, acrimony all the time. So, first of all, I've come across all these amazing organizations that are trying to do these bipartisan things. JD and I just did this thing yesterday. I'd never heard of it. It's called With Honor. It's like a veterans group that, again, is trying to be bipartisan and reach out. There's Better Angels. But I have an idea that I thought it was this original idea on my part, but I've been getting all these emails from very famous people and then from like 10th graders with the same idea. And it's the idea of I guess you could call it like a public national service program. I think it'd be hard to make it mandatory, but here's the idea. Right now, a lot of our high school kids, especially privileged kids, will go off to do a gap year after high school. They'll go to Australia or Amsterdam or Guatemala, often with their own privileged friends, but they will do amazing, wonderful things. I'm not knocking that. But what if we had a program, or we incentivized a program, where Americans from Manhattan or LA or San Francisco would go to another part of America where they would ordinarily never go, and work side by side with other young Americans, and not in a condescending way. Not like, let's educate you. I mean, this is always this big problem JD identifies, but really side by side. So I actually have a couple research assistants there who did Teach for America and Peace Corps, who are actively trying to build this. So that's the kind of thing that that I'm thinking of.
So just one thought in response. I don't know if I saw Arthur Brooks earlier, but I don't know if he's actually here. But he got me this sweater, so I have to say nice things about him. But Arthur talks about the power of individual storytelling. And when I think about Hillbilly Elegy and why it was ultimately successful, I do think that whether it's talking about issues that are of special concern to minorities or to the white working class or to any particular group, actually telling a story about a human experience that's real is a lot more persuasive than just throwing a purely data-driven argument at somebody. Now, of course, the data is important, and I think it's important that our arguments are ultimately informed by the data so that we're not irresponsible. But it's remarkable to me how talking about disparities in policing as a general matter is not persuasive. Talking about an individual person who was affected by a negative experience with the police, that is super persuasive. And I just think that we've lost some ability to talk at a human-to-human level, which is ultimately a much more persuasive way to discuss these issues.
What's fascinating about that Arthur Brooks mentioned that about individual storytelling, is another point. I like to think of it as a reason for optimism, that we actually do have a lot of common ground, because critical race theory, for example, which the right hates, this is it tends to be very liberal classes. Critical race theory, their main premise is storytelling too, right? In the sense that that's a way of conveying messages. But yes.
Good, Mike's coming around here. Yeah.
Thank you. I teach at an independent school in Maryland, and it's K through 12, 1,300 students, quite diverse, not as diverse as we would like. But a few years ago, we had as a faculty assigned reading over the summer, and the title of the book was, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit at the Same Table? It became a springboard for a discussion about affinity groups. And we discovered that we commented and noticed those black kids are always sitting at the same table, and nobody ever questioned why the white girls on the lacrosse team sat at the same table. And we realized that as a group, we had broken through a barrier and we had to address fundamental assumptions. So we now acknowledge what are called affinity groups. You have likes, like I have a small group of Jewish faculty members and we can kibitz at the table. Now, that's kibitz if, there are people in the room who have heard other people using Yiddish and they'll say kibbutz. And we have to kind of correct them. But, schlep and chutzpah, that's all out there, right? So what I'm saying is that within our individual groups, our corporations, our schools, our hospitals, our financial firms, the vocabulary, is so important, but it's also threatening. And what I've discovered is that there are different kinds of curiosities in our country. What the question I have is that, for example, the Jefferson Institute and at Monticello, they have specifically now changed all of the education in the tours to include the term enslaved peoples, because the Constitution specifically denied that the slaves were human and assigned a number, 3/5. That's a very important concept. But if you get out and you're talking about the elites, education becomes a kind of barometer of insecurity. Once you start to use vocabulary that's valid and interesting and inspires curiosity, there's a turnoff. That's elite. So we kind of get into this catch-22. How can we talk the truth and assign the important language like enslaved people and affinity and go beyond there if our educational differences are so vast?
Yeah, well, I think I don't have much to add to that, because I think it's really a question that we're dealing with every day on college campuses. That there are renaming committees that, and we're really trying to strike that balance. And I think you put it more articulate. Jay, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess I would say we shouldn't shy away from vocabulary just because it makes us uncomfortable, but we also shouldn't use discomfort as the only barometer of the way that we speak to other people. And I do think that, I've had a lot of these conversations with friends and family. I've had a lot of these conversations with perfect strangers. And I always try to frame these things as, am I being persuasive to the audience that I'm actually speaking to? And I think that requires you to have some embedded sense of their own biases. It maybe requires that you say things in a slightly different way. But ultimately, I think the purpose in a democracy like ours, especially one that's as diverse as ours is it should be to persuade other people and to be open to persuasion. And so discomfort can be important, and we shouldn't shy away from it. I also think that it's not always a good thing to be uncomfortable. Sometimes it's good to be comfortable. Sometimes these affinity groups are useful because they create comfort and they create some space for folks to talk about issues that are of special concern to them.
Okay. Great, a few more questions. Let's see.
Somebody over here? Sir in the kind of red and white shirt there, you had your hand up a couple times.
Hi, former hillbilly, current coastal elite. I was enlisted in the Marine Corps, and now I'm an attorney. I have lots of friends in the Midwest who are not coastal elites, and I can talk to them and say, hey, the sky is blue, and I can have a 20-minute conversation and say, look outside, it's blue, and here are all the reasons why it's blue. And then they'll go on their favorite news channel and they'll say the sky's black, and then everything I said goes out the window. And so I guess the elephant in the room is, how can we combat organizations that exist explicitly to push on this tribalism? Because I think, I don't want to scare anybody, but I know these people. If the president tweeted something like, start killing liberals, these people will do it. I think we're at that point now. And so I don't know how we combat that when we're allowed to have institutions continue to argue in bad faith.
Do you want to answer that? Or do you want to take a few more questions?
Yeah,
Or do
maybe
you want-
we'll take a couple more questions
Why
and
don't we
answer them.
and then we'll do a quick,
we
right
have a few
next
minutes.
to you. Yeah, okay.
I'd like to take that concept a step further. You had said that in order for this, your concept of a supergroup, I'm not sure that's the right term, we need to allow the individual tribes to flourish. I want to focus on what kind of political institutional changes would allow that to occur, and whether it's even possible, because I don't think talk matters. I think that's your point as well.
Want to do one more?
Yeah, one more, and then we'll answer. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left.
Yeah.
Many people, including myself, favor a huge national investment to create opportunity in what is called Red America. And that includes actually going to places and helping to train, to work on common projects. But it requires investment at all levels of government as well as the private sector. The problem is, what do the folks who voted for Trump in more rural parts of America really want? And Arthur Brooks suggests they want respect. They actually don't want, at the moment, what I and others might want to give them. They want something else. They want respect and return to a world that never really existed, but that they dream of as the right world.
Great. Okay. Do you want to take?
So I'll try to answer a few questions at once, and I'll try to be quick. So here's the thing about this, and I recognize this is not necessarily the most open room to this argument. I mean, I think that we're all tribal in our own way, and I do think that there's a conceit among broadly spoken coastal elites in thinking that access to information and access to the truth is uniquely a possession that they have. So let me just illustrate this in a few ways on a few critical issues. In the late 1990s, let me illustrate this a slightly different way. In 2002, 2003, there was a bipartisan consensus that one, Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. Across the political spectrum, from the Brookings Institute to AEI, you could hear people saying and making that argument, and that the war to overthrow Saddam Hussein would be relatively painless. In 2006, 2007, you could hear elites from across the political spectrum argue that there was no major problem in the American financial sector and that our economy was fundamentally healthy. In 2016, and I know this because I did a lot of TV then, you could hear elites from across the political spectrum say there is no way that Donald Trump will win the presidential election. Hillary Clinton is going to be president in January of 2017. And on all of those issues, I mean, the first two with catastrophic consequences, the elite opinion makers were fundamentally wrong. What they thought was true was not actually true. And I do think that there is sometimes a herd mentality that sets in among everybody. I'm no fan of fake news. I'm no fan of the various rumor mills that start, complete lies on Facebook and drive people insane. I think that it's really bad for our democracy. But I think part of recognizing that people don't trust the mainstream media is to recognize that sometimes the mainstream media hasn't been totally right. The one final point I'll make on this is that the current cover of Time magazine has a child on it that was pitched as a person who was separated from their children, or pitched as a person who was separated from their parents at the Mexican border. It turns out that person, the child, that crying child who's looking up at President Trump on the cover of Time magazine, that child actually was not separated from her mother. She was reunited with her mother, and she's currently with her mother right now. That creates a sense of skepticism of mainstream institutions. So I'll all the time push on people not to take such a skeptical posture, not to assume that everything they read on Facebook is true. But I also think it requires elites to actually rebuild trust in some of these institutions, and they haven't totally lost it for illegitimate reasons. Some of the reasons they've lost that sense of trust is totally legitimate.
Maybe I'll end, since I think our time is up. And my response goes back to this vocabulary thing. I think what we all, in response to your questions, just what we can do at an individual level is just maybe narrow in your own heart who the enemy is. because we're all very us versus them. And I feel this way, and it's very personal. If somebody does something cruel to you or mean or terrible, I get extremely angry, and it's very easy to just feel angry at the whole group in some ways. So it's very human. And it's what I see because of cable news and Fox and both sides there are these huge terms now. So like social justice warrior. Okay, that's one that the right uses all the time. And I was talking to somebody, I was like, it's like this gargantuan category, and they have in their head an image of somebody screaming on Fox News. But I have students, I was like, here's somebody that you would call a social justice warrior, a Yale law student who worked quietly for 3 years, and the team just freed a person who had been improperly imprisoned for 30 years on a DNA test. See, I think this is an idea of whether you're Republican or Democrat, everybody likes that, right? I mean, that's a great act of justice that people fought, and that was a social justice warrior. And I think on the other side, too, I see among my left-wing students, it's like the Trump voter. I mean, this gigantic category of bigoted, misogynist, racists, and it's just to assign these, I've been studying discrimination and prejudice and ethnic conflict for 20 years, mostly in other countries, but that actually is the definition of prejudice, when you assign these gigantic characteristics to huge numbers of faceless people that you've never met. So anyway, I guess, is there a way to end on a more optimistic note?